Thanks very much to you and Sangam Talks. I think I should also thank Swarajya and its editors for publishing this article, which I suppose was quite effective because that occasioned this invitation to me as well. But this subject that I have been writing on this subject since many years, and many have been published before, but they were not much noted. And I think these kind of things, it takes time for a certain idea to just get more, um, just to become more widespread. And as everybody knows, these kind of articles were not, there was no scope to do that before the turn of the century, especially only after the internet came to be that, writers like me had any chance of publishing things. And the first of these was, I still remember the first of my articles on this topic was why this bias against Hinduism. And it was published in two parts in a news portal run, I mean, it was operated by Indians abroad. I think they were in the States, and it was called India Cause. And they were compiling news items relevant for India and Hindus at that time. And along with that, they were publishing, other writers, independent writers as well. And so I sent these two articles. And after that, then slowly people were asking me about me, and then I started writing for Sandhya Jain's open, complete opinion forum called Vijayawani, and most of my articles have been published in that. And she was instrumental in encouraging me to write more and more. And then of course, I had been to, I was invited to Houston, Texas, and deliver the Sri Sitaram Goel lecture. That was in 2012, and that was titled Jesus Christ in the Light of Sanatana Dharma. And that was a serious comparison of Christianity and Hindu Dharma, especially how Christianity can be viewed from the Hindu viewpoint. And of course, you know that before this reawakening of this pagan India, I had also published this Hindu polities versus global monotheism that was in India Facts, and that was also in three parts. And it had a very similar topic. I mean, it was the same, almost the same, similar subject. But I think this when I thought of not talking about what I have written, but in general how I came to into this comparative religion as a topic, and how it is viewed from the academic, objectively by academics, and how I mean I will not go into the details of all that because I don't think it is very relevant here. But at the same time, it would be good for listeners to know how it is viewed in other places. But because everyone personally will have a kind of encounter with other religions, that is where comparative religion comes to be, in real life. That was the same with me as well, because, as a child, I think I was a little more religious than the usual people. Because I remember when I was initiated into the church when I was just past five, and they started giving me all these things about Christian love, peace, and how Jesus comes to save us and all that. And we lived in a Christian joint family, actually. My father's brothers were there, their families, my grandmother, my aunties. And so it was, but at the same time, except for my grandmother, nobody was very fervent about religion. She was the one, who organized all these prayers and all that kind of stuff. At, at sunset, she always lit the lamp, and we all had to do this, and we had to start our prayers. And our neighbors, I could hear, they used to say, they were mostly Hindus all around, and they say, Rama, Rama, Pahima. And we always say about Jesus Christ and how we are sinners and all that. So this is part and parcel of the Christian life, because all their doctrines, everything was so. That was a big difference for me. And I also remember there were some Jews living nearby because I was born and brought up in the Catholic capital of India, which is Cochin. It is not Goa, by the way. It is Cochin and Kerala, which is the Catholic and Christian capital of India, even now, because that is where the most of the nuns and priests come from. They are at the forefront of all evangelization in India. They are the leaders, actually. I mean, not only for Catholics, but in all other churches and these Pentecostals and so on. So when I remember that I was taken to my Jewish neighbors, and they were actually going to Israel. It was in the 60s. I think it was in the mid 60s, and they were going, and they came and bade goodbye, bid goodbye, and said we are going, and they were in tears actually. And then when we went to this house, I was not eating anything, and when we came back, my auntie was asking, why you didn't have even anything from there? And I was saying, oh, they're Jews, they killed Jesus. I still remember that. And my auntie was very angry with me. He said, oh, they are Jews, but we are Christians, and this is nothing like that. They're not the guys who really killed Jesus, and so on. And then remember another instance, when we used to discuss with my siblings. I had three sisters. I have three sisters and one brother. And my two sisters were elder to me, and they were the leading things. So we were saying, oh, after life, oh, after death, what will happen? And then we had this purgatory waiting for us, or hell, or heaven, and so on. And we were all frightened. And my elder sister was saying, there are other viewpoints on this, because the Hindus think that, the Atman after death who will merge with the Paramatman and so on. And that interested me. And I thought, okay, this is a different viewpoint and worth looking at. But I was just hardly 10 years old. Then I went to a boarding school, which is also was a Christian Catholic school. And there I came firsthand, with this church and the people who were running it. And that somehow just what extinguished all my devotion. And if I had gone to a government school, probably I would have turned up differently. So this was really, I still remember one instance, when one boy, one of my classmates, he was shouting to one of these people who were running the mess, some women, and he used some very bad words. And there was this nun who came and said, oh, you shouldn't do that. You are a Christian, and just because you are a Christian, you shouldn't be doing that. So some of my Hindu friends were very angry at hearing that, and then I still remember they were having a spat between them, the nuns and these boys, and that somehow after school I just left the church. I was just 15 years old, but I just decided I will not have anything to do with the church. So that was, then I started looking at other things. And fortunately, I also had occasion after my MA in English, and I had a training in journalism for some time, but somehow I was suffering from existential problems because I was an atheist, and I had no direction, no motivation. But fortunately, at that time, I met one journalist who himself was in a trouble, but I didn't know at that time, and because he himself was going through a bad time, and because he was with the Reuters, but then later he picked up, he became an editor of one traditionalist Catholic magazine, a journal called Insight, which was sponsored by his friends, by his brother. One of his brother was a priest in the U.S., a Catholic priest, and he was funding it because he became a traditionalist. And for those who are not informed, traditionalist Catholics were those who did not like the second Reformation, which happened in Vatican. That was in 1962 that they completed that. So they remained, with the doctrines and the rituals of the previous church. I mean, that was before the 1962. So this church is called the Traditionalist Catholics, and it was one cardinal called Marcel Lefebvre who, led this movement. And there were, of course, people in India, in Cochin as well, who were traditional Catholics. And if you know this, Mel Gibson, the famous actor, he belongs to that church. And his father was also belonged to that. Hutton Gibson was his name, and he has written a book about the Pope who brought the Reformation, and it was called The Man of Sin. That is how he addressed the Pope who made these, because the predominant, I mean, the main thing about this Reformation was that the redemption was opened to all the others as well, not only to Catholics, but to all other religions, at least symbolically. And that is when they used to conduct the mass, turning the backside to the audience, but they changed that. They began to face the audience, and then that is how, after the Reformation, that was happened. So these journalist was also belonged to that, but at a certain point he came to know that he, he was in a big dilemma because um, he was researching Krishna because the traditional Catholics, some of them, especially his sponsors, they wanted him to research Krishna and say that Krishna came after Jesus because in their life they had some similarities, and so that the Hindus were plagiarists who plagiarized Jesus Christ, and that is how Krishna came. But his name was Leo Panikkal. He's no more. And Panikkal found that this was not true. That Krishna was much older, and that he stopped his everything. He just stopped whatever he was doing. So this was also a turning point in my life, and then I started looking and started reading Vivekananda and Adi Shankar and so on. So, and the one thing that I made a marking, I mean, a very marked, a very distinctive impression on me was, the emphasis on rationality and reason. And so I added this dimension of rationality to religion as well, that it is not separate. It cannot be separate. You cannot see this because there are people, even before that especially in comparative religious studies, for example, academically as well, people were more or less looking at these features. Either they wanted to establish the superiority of a certain religion, or they just wanted to show, if they just to say that these are these features. Religion is a spirituality, is a phenomenon, so you cannot, and it cannot be separated from its context, cultural context, and so on. I mean, this was the thing which happens, and that is what is comparative religion is all about. Especially because in today's in Wikipedia and in encyclopedia.com, if one were to look at all these, you would find that these you would see that the first people who started these comparative studies, Al-Biruni and Ibn Hashim, and so on, because they were criticizing Christianity at that time. Then somebody was calling Max Muller as the father of comparative religion. Then there were some anthropologists who were, documented many religions, which we may call them primitive from today's, zeitgeist. But these were the comparative religion that was going on. And of course, there was, as a one more, I mean, it became a little more systematic, one should say, with Mircea Eliade of the University of Chicago, who propounded the new humanism. And then came criticism of all that later on by one Jonathan Smith, in his critical essay called The History of Religions, and this was in 1971. And this challenged the methodology and the control of what passed as comparison. And, there were several points that he and many others as well were found, disputed because this is not the right way to do comparative religion, because there was because nobody knew how to evaluate religion and how to compare religion, and anybody who did that had some vested interest to do that. So this was going on, and for example, some people said it is this comparativism is very theological, since because it originates in divine revelation. So, for a natural religionist, for example, this doesn't make sense, because how can somebody's revelation apply to my own life, because I have a different worldview and so on. And then there was this argument that the comparative religion is not objective enough, that it is only descriptive. There is no explanation about, giving you just to give some attributes of one religion, and then you say this is like this and this is like that. And then, slowly there were other changes as well. For example, by Barbara Holbrook, for example, who wrote this Veda and Torah, she found a lot of similarities between the Hindus and the Jews, how they conducted themselves in their religious life. For example, even these sacred thread that they used, the Jews also used some made of leather and so on. I mean, there are many similarities as well, but at the same time, this is something. There are so it became like that. You just showcase these things, these attributes, and say that this is comparative religion. That was what was going on. And in 1998, in what became, or what was called, a new trend in comparative religion, was Wendy Doniger's book, The Implied Spider. It came in 1998, and which was supposed to give a bottom up rather than a top down approach. What is meant by that is that, you don't compare the doctrines or lofty theological aspects or even gods or in beliefs in gods, but what these religions and religious practices were in, for example, from a pan-human factors, such as gender, sexuality, body, desire, and procreation, as well as shared human problems. So, from this, of course, by doing this, actually, Doniger purported to showcase cultural differences in various religions when tackling the self-same human problems, because the human species have the same problems. So religion should satisfy their problems, and not just, you bring in a god, and you can't just do that. So in that way, Wendy Doniger comes very close to the truth, but yet remain far. At least I may say that she comes to the doorstep of humanity. That's the first time, in all these comparative religion, that is, the humanity is a bigger factor when it comes to religion. So, that it is that is where the point is that it is whatever religion it is, whatever it is a comparative religion or not, it has to do with humans and human problems, and it should satisfy the human sentiment for religion. So what I found that, I mean, Doniger's thesis, for example, they stay, they stagnate because their thought process, they examine only the stark physical things. It is almost as if a Marxist is comparing the religions here. That whatever is concerning the body, your desires, your very bodily desires, I mean that has to satisfy these. And they're even when they analyze, when their skills are all, they cannot rise beyond the material and gross physical. For example, in yogic terms, you can say that these type of scholars, they cannot rise beyond the Muladhara chakra. I mean, these chakras above that, they are completely ignorant of that, or they rather don't want to examine that, which means that it is like the Marxists, who are not concerned about anything else except consumerism, your stomach, your body, your desires, and there is nothing more than that. And I think this is applicable to all Western scholars. I mean, not all, of course, in general terms, when they tackle Indian knowledge systems, because their level of thinking is at the body level. They cannot rise beyond that especially when they examine Indian knowledge systems. And this reminds me of one of my friends. He's an American, and he's a very popular blogger called the Les Visible, LES Visible. And he once told me a story. Probably heard it from somewhere, maybe an Indian. And it is about a man who is searching for the ultimate reality. And then he comes to a wise man and he says, "Okay, you go to this building, there is that building there, and you go and look, and you can find the ultimate reality there." So he goes there and finds that it is a seven-story building, and he enters the ground floor, and he finds that it in this the ground floor is all about your body, it's all about drink, sex, and drugs, and all that, and this guy, he doesn't go up anymore. He doesn't want to go up. He wants to stay in the first floor. So he doesn't want to explore the other things because he's satisfied with it. He thinks that there is no more to be learned, or no more to be enjoyed, or nothing more to be known. So this is the case with the communism. Particularly Marxism, as well as Christianity and Islam, because in their core doctrines, they reduce the human condition, that is the entire human species, to mere bogies, just consumers. There is nothing beyond that. Because even when I used to think about, the afterlife, that when the last judgment and all that, they're still what do they get in paradise? It's the same old human sentiments that you get with the body. Without a body, they cannot think of a heaven, because a heaven is a place of pleasure in the sense, the physical pleasure. So these even very very learned scholars, they cannot get beyond that when they come to terms with the Indian knowledge systems. So what I meant to say was this: their evolution as a species itself has stagnated because of that, because no vision beyond their body sensations. This, of course, when it comes to comparative religion, was also there was another trend that was also popular in the last decade of the last century, and it was called the interfaith dialogue. Actually, it is credited to one Presbyterian minister from Canada called Wilfred Cantwell Smith. But actually, it were the Catholics who really initiated it after the Second Vatican Council, because the evangelization before the Reformation was that we held this exclusive redemption, so that was the point. But then later, because what do you call the zeitgeist? The people, the, that is the spirit of the times that can change people, because you achieve without anything a certain time, that the spirit of the time can bring in a lot of a certain sensitivity, certain awareness that you did not have in a previous age. So just like that, they found it is difficult to just go and convert people, especially when they are educated and so on. So they devised this interfaith dialogue, and many of these, and one person who comes to my mind is Reverend Father Francis Xavier Clooney. He was a professor in Harvard School of Divinity, actually, and he was very active at the time. And many Hindus fell for his tricks. He used to come to Chennai very frequently, and he's written books about comparative religious books about Mariam and Mary, and how the devotion to Mariam and by the Tamils, and he compares it to these sentiments with Mary, and slowly, then comes the Jesus, and yeah, after the dialogue becomes a monologue, and finally, this is what they were putting inside. But somehow this has also disappeared, because Hindus have also come to know what this means, and because they are also educated now, people come to know there is more dissemination of knowledge and information. So many people have become aware of this, especially after the advent of the internet. So now the question is, why is comparative religion important? It is, of course, not for aesthetic reasons, that you compare Western classical music with the Indian or any other Eastern classical systems. Comparative religion is important because religion is important. And why is religion important? It is because it is our religion that provides us a worldview on which our entire life on earth depends. It is this worldview that provides the knowledge about our existence, our life, our death. The religion that provides you with the true worldview is the true religion, because the true worldview makes our individual lives meaningful, enriches the society, and gives the human species sanity. Your innate beliefs corroborate and confirm perceived phenomena. Your experiences tally with your beliefs and do not contradict them. If, on the contrary, if your religion is faulty and erroneous, your experiences will certainly contradict your worldview. That you will, at some point, you expect something from your action and you get the opposite, and you have panic. It is a natural human thing. You go and you have put something in a box, and you go and open the box to take it, and you find a snake. You are really in a panic. So it is like that. When your experience contradicts, you will lose your sanity. Our personal lives, as well as the life of society, and by extension, our polity, will suffer. The whole humanity will suffer. If there is so much man made conflicts and suffering in this world, it is because of these religions, these error prone religions like Christianity, Islam, and also communism, which is also a religion without the God. The evolutionary process of our species has come to a halt because of the dominance of these three ideologies. For example, I was just looking on Google, about the religion, and then there was a question: what is the best religion? And they have given this the number of people in Christianity, it is the highest, and the second it comes Islam. So it is by the number of adherents to a certain religion that is the popular sentiment of the popular information. Anybody who looks in Google, oh, which is the best religion? I want to know. And you come, oh, the most number of people is this. And in another 2 or 3 decades, it will be the Islam that will be the best religion. So, and how these religions came to achieve this status, it is through violence, it is through aggression. So these things, it is actually, who decides which is the best religion? It is the power. I mean, it is the power, the physical power that determines your spiritual, rating, for example. So these, by doctrine, these Abrahamic strains redirect the human spirit to the gross body. They will not allow the human spirit to rise from the Muladhara chakra. It is, as long as they are there, it will never allow. Look at any area of conflict in the world, be it Africa or anywhere else. But the root cause are these religions. And why? Because they're not true. They're not true religions because they have nothing to do with the reality. Therefore, when we compare religions, we need to compare a religion not with other religions, but with the benchmarks of reality. They should stand the test of scientific principles. It's, for example, I mean, that is where Sanatana Dharma and the Hindu philosophical doctrines gain significance. This is how Sanatana Dharma becomes the benchmark of religion for the human species. Now, one may ask, what is the main trait of our species? What is this species? What is so common? That everything that everything should be applicable to the species. When you say species can be different, one person may not need all these. So the chief characteristic of our species is reflection. The ability, the thinking process. That is when we use this, our Indian language, and we say we are all Manushya. That is the progeny of Manu, which means this progeny of the one who thinks. That is our species. It is not because you walk on 2 legs. It is because you think. It is by this principle that one must assess each religion, and that is the only valid approach to comparative religion. Thank you, friends, for your patience and time. That is all.
As you mentioned that there was this this bogey that pushed forward that Sri Krishna came after Jesus because a lot of similar happenings happened in their life. Polonius of Tyana, contemporary of Jesus Christ, and supposedly his whole life and biography was made into a person called Jesus, where actually it was Apollonius of Tyana who was the actual pagan Jesus that they say.
That at that time, there was not just one Jesus. There were many Jesus like that because it was at that time it was very popular for people. At every corner you find a prophet who was, they're trying to prophecy. This these kind of prophets at every corner, and so I don't think, of course, Apollonius was one of them, but there were equally others who became a model for Jesus. There is no doubt about that. Whether there was whether this what you call Jesus, son of Mary, existed or not, it is, you can never say. There is no proper proof for that. But of course, there were many Jesuses at that time. There is no doubt, and Apollonius is one of them.
One of the main points in your article point about the takeover of the temples by the state, which is a very big reason for the constant deterioration of the education system and the whole handling of the temples. So, what are your views on that?
I know of what really happened in Kerala, for example. That was the time when, the Travancore, especially because it was the richest state in Kerala at that time. And there was one resident, one British resident, he came here. And he was instrumental in because he found that most of the land, the public land, the most what you call public land was owned by the temples. Because here in Kerala, we had a very peculiar history because it were the Brahmins who owned, I mean, it was the temples who owned everything because the Brahmins were in power. Because here there were the Brahmins and the Shudras. It was not like in northern parts of India what happened here. So the Brahmins ruled for a long, long time. And it was only in recent times, that they lost power. And the first things the new kings did was to get these, even Martanda Varma, the founder of the Travancore Empire, he just, it was the first places he conquered were the temples because they were the powerhouses. This was throughout Kerala, it was like that because the Brahmins, that is how the Brahmins lost power because they lost power of the temples. So this suited both, I think, it to a certain degree the king as well as the British resident because he was facilitating, that everything so that the land went to the churches. For example, the CMS, the Christian Missionary Society of the English, these British Protestants, they were here and they sort of took over much of these temple lands were converted into Christian schools or churches and for all other purposes. So that was the beginning. So it started actually quite a long time ago. And slowly, slowly, this became a kind of, a precedence by which even later when, it became independent also, they tried to do that because then Marxism had become an established ideology here. Especially they prevailed upon, the so-called, subaltern classes and all that, these untouchables and the low caste, what they were called. And that actually it is a very, very interesting if one looks at it from a different way because it was as if, because the whole, for the temple entry movement and all that, actually these people did not want to enter the temples because that would imply that they did not have their own belief systems. They had their own, everybody. I mean, these temple worship was actually confined to a certain few people, and the others, every jati had their own culture. They had they are very rich. You can still see in some of these ritual rites and so on. Like Padayani and Teyyam and all that. These they were it were actually the upper caste who had joined who imbibed the British sentiments and joined Mahatma Gandhi, and they said, oh, and for example, in Wycombe, that was where the first place where, of course, these people who were denied entry to certain streets, that is all they wanted. They wanted to walk the streets. They did not want to go to a temple because that was somebody else's worship place. Were not interested. And one guy, I still remember. I mean, I've seen the photographs that one guy was bodily carried inside because he refused to go in the temple, but he was. But with that entry, whatever they had, whatever their ancestors had, all their cultural, assets were gone in a flash. So all these people, bereft of their own cultural assets, they became Marxists. That is what happens. You see in Kerala now. And many, of course, converted as well.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One is that Abrahamics, whatever you may say, are actually doing a lot of comparative religion. What do you think accounts for the relative absence of this kind of discipline in pagan societies? A systematic discipline in pagan societies, especially among Hindus. And secondly, can there be a uniquely Hindu approach to this discipline of comparative religion? These are my two questions. Thank you.
This comparative, because the Abrahamic religions actually they thrive on this comparative, because without demeaning or down, how do you say that, without putting down one religion, they cannot be in a better state. They always their complete um, what do you call dynamics is to project as if they are in the forefront. They are very competitive in the sense, without asserting themselves as we are on the upper level. We are not, or if we all say, oh, all religions are equal, then we are more than equal. So with that is what motivates them to this discipline and all that. That is why they carry it wherever they go. And there is another thing which I must say, because it comes from competition, this competitive spirit, which the pagan societies don't have. And this, I mean, it is very difficult to find out how it is a trait which you find. You probably must have heard it is called Asura Panchakam, Asura Dharma Panchakam. These are the five dharmas of Asuras, and one of them is competition, because Asuras always have competition. And this is an Asura trait, this competition. And without that, they cannot sustain themselves. I mean, it is their innate dharma. So it comes out. So that is the reason. And that is the same reason that, these pagan and especially Hindus don't have that competition. I mean, of course, it started because they started to imitate the others in order to, just for survival. That is the reason why you hear about, the Hindus are also asserting physically with violence, with aggression, and that is just a reaction, a response. But they're not, of course, you can say that these Asura traits are there in many societies, but it is not a spiritual trait of the Hindus.
My second question was, is there a uniquely Hindu approach to comparative religion?
I mean, it is actually due to the first reason that Hindus don't have this competition. They don't have to assert that ours is this, because even in the Vedas, you see, there is this element of skepticism in everything. Because whatever we say, it is not with the, there is absolute thing is never there. Even the rishis never asserted like that, that you have to, it is this and it is that, because there is always an element of doubt. It is our experience which is, so that is the reason there is no discipline. Of course, just like I said, because Hindus have also started doing it, but it is not and maybe in due time it will happen. It has to happen, because the truth has to prevail. So this has to come. That is what I think. But as it is, you don't find it because it was not necessary so far. I suppose I'll make myself clear.
This is a question about Kerala. I mean, it's about Kerala. So, given that Kerala, Christianity has made a lot of progress in Kerala in terms of numbers.
Yes.
Historically, how much anti-Semitism has there been among Keralites? And currently, is it increasing with increasing number of conversions, or does anti-Semitism not figure in Indian Christianity? What happens there?
Anti-Semitism. Sorry again. My thing. I mean, my audio went to mute. Um, By anti-Semitism, what exactly do you mean? I mean, you mean this animosity against the Jews? Is that correct?
Yes, precisely. I mean, a doctrinal animosity and maybe social animosity against the Jews, the kind you saw in Europe.
Yeah, that was not here because there is a reason for that. Because the first Christians to come here, they were all converts I mean, they were Hebrews who were converted. They were Jews basically, and many of the Christian, I mean, things, they were following the Jewish things here, and all even the later converts follow that. The what was happened before. So there were never any conflict between the Jews and Christians here. Even with Muslims, it was not there earlier, but now there is, of course, in recent years, some things have come, but not before. You heard, because there was a very vibrant Jewish community in Cochin and in Kerala, in other places as well. But there had never been any problem between Christians, especially, and the Jews. And even with the Muslims, there had not been any problem. There had not been any conflict. I think one reason is that, because they were all similar communities in a Hindu majority place. So that might have been one reason, because they could all integrate as a one jati. Jews were one jati and Christians were one, and so on.